Dr. Reed, who works for Rogers Health is in the Education and Advocacy Division of Rogers Behavioral Health. She has a doctoral degree in ecological community psychology from Michigan State University. She works through partnerships to reduce the stigma associated with mental health challenges, trauma, and substance abuse.
Thank you so much for having me here today and for your grace and understanding that I am here in lieu of my colleague, Emily Jonesberg, who unfortunately is contending with some health-related challenges, talk about compassion fatigue. So I will try to do justice in her stead to this very important, very relevant, all too timely topic related to parental and caregiver compassion fatigue. I'm going to take a moment to pull up a slide deck here. So a little bit of background, we at Rogers InHealth have been working on the Compassion Resilience Toolkit now for parents and educators for going on 8 or 9 months. It is a publicly available, entirely accessible and free toolkit that is online. You can find it at compassionresilienceToolkit.org or the website listed on the first slide here. And it largely emerged because we found that parents and caregivers, many of you in the audience, I imagine, experience extreme levels of fatigue and burnout and yet aren't able to talk about it. And many of the parenting interventions, programs, strategies that exist are far and away geared more towards children or parenting strategies related to children. And we really thought there was a void as to interventions and approaches, well-being strategies that are directly geared towards parents and caregivers yourselves. And so that's where we come in. You might recognize that Rogers InHealth and the Wisconsin Initiative for Stigma Elimination that I am affiliated with, our background is in regards to stigma reduction and increasing inclusion, hope, and support for people and families with behavioral health challenges. And so the natural question might be, why the heck are you interested in compassion resilience? What's the connection there? And we found that in practice, where a number of young people were apt to experience the highest degrees or highest severity of stigma were in helping professions. They were the very people charged with caregiving, in a sense. It was from school-related personnel and educators, so in school systems, and then from health and human service, from those who are in clinical capacities or healthcare. And you can imagine now in the midst of COVID, how this may even be more prevalent than ever. And so we thought people's innate propensity as human beings in helping professions is one of compassion. We are compassionate people. We are compassionate caregivers, and I am willing to bet that those of you on the call today, you're showing up to learn about this, are compassionate parents and caregivers as well. And yet, sometimes we don't bring our best selves to our interactions with young people and to those we serve and to those for whom we care. And that really is not an indictment of us as individuals or an internal flaw by any way, shape, or form, but rather our compassion resilience might be lacking. We might be feeling burnt out. We might ebb and flow with our ability to show up and be compassionate throughout the course of the day or over the course of the life course or during times of really difficult transition, such as what we're all facing now, right? Day in and day out, our compassion fatigue may heighten and our reservoir of resilience may decrease. So that's what we are hoping to address through our Compassion Resilience Toolkit. It is traditionally about 12 hours of small group related content. And so I am just aiming to hit the tip of the iceberg on some of the key strategies that you might utilize yourselves to support your parenting and caregiving practices. So that is my goal in any case. For all of these presentations, we like to start out with a very brief pause, just a time in which to become mindful, to check in with ourselves, to engage with what is going on around us so that we might bring our attention to the task at hand. And so I'm just going to ask those of you who are on with us here today will give me a moment to just take that pause with and for one another and for ourselves, and focus on your breath. Maybe take in a few slow breaths and think to yourself your intention for our time together, your why. Why are you here tonight? What is it you are hoping to learn or take away or change? And just take a few more slow inhales and exhales, disregarding the noise in the background as I am in an apartment complex. And then we will reconvene and come back together and proceed through our content here today. What the heck do I mean by compassion, resilience, anyway? I have had a number of you wonder, what am I even getting myself into here? Sounds interesting, although it is becoming quite popular as of late to consider this idea of resilience amongst those in helping in human service professions and parenting and caregiving roles. What I mean is that it is the power to return to a place of empathy, strength, and hope when we face daily challenges in our lives and see the challenges those we care for face as well. In short, the non-dictionary version or rendition is here bolded. We are able to find optimism in an imperfect world, ultimately. And that really speaks to me, whether it's optimism in an imperfect environment, optimism in an imperfect community, optimism in an imperfect family, some kind of optimism that proceeds to help us forward amidst challenges, amidst burnout, amidst all of the uncertainty in our midst. And boy, we sure face a lot of that right now, to say the least. And so what we've found in practice is that one of the absolute best antidotes to ultimately compassion fatigue, or the absence of compassion resilience, being burnt out or exposed to secondary trauma and feeling the effects of it, is that of self-compassion. Absolutely imperative to have a sense of self-compassion in order to help us either show up consistently with compassion for others or to be kind to ourselves when we're unable to, when we inevitably do experience fatigue in some way. And so what do I mean by self-compassion? You might be familiar with the work of Dr. Kristin Neff, fantastic researcher, guru of self-compassion. Highly, highly suggest her mindful self-compassion courses if ever you're able to take one of them. And Kristin Neff suggests there are 3 core components of self-compassion. And as I'm talking about these, maybe call up a time in the last week where you're a bit hard on yourself or critical or judgmental. Maybe you didn't quite meet an expectation you had for yourself or someone else had for you. Think about what that experience would have been like if rather than be critical and judgmental, we could have had a degree of kindness or forgiveness or grace for ourselves. Maybe we'd said to ourselves in that case, something like we might tell a best friend or a good friend. What if during that experience we recognized that other people had experienced something similar, that they had faced similar challenges, that they were similarly overwhelmed or feeling stressed or had made similar mistakes? We all suffer in some way, shape, or form. We are all imperfect beings as humans. It is part and parcel to growing and learning and adapting. And so this element of common humanity is so imperative because it keeps us from isolating ourselves, from withdrawing, and from not seeking out the support that could otherwise be really helpful. And still thinking about that experience or interaction where perhaps you fell short in some way, shape, or form, what if we were able to recognize how we were feeling in that moment, and rather than dwell on it or be consumed by it or berate ourselves for it, to recognize the frustration or disappointment, and then to move on. There's that element of letting go in some way to much of this work. And so this idea of self-compassion, I want you to keep in mind throughout the course of this presentation, as I'm sure some of it will fall in the face of other things that you may well have been taught or will be insightful in some way, and you didn't have the information before today. So that's that element of being kind and recognizing where we're at. And we might recognize ourselves in the stages of fatigue that I'm about to share with you. And that is okay. It is very normal to experience fatigue in caregiving professions and roles. And so please consider that element of grace and that element of common humanity, and that we are much more alike than we are different. So with that in mind, before moving on to what fatigue looks like, sounds like, and feels like for us as parents and caregivers, I want to just take a moment to pause and recognize what we mean by acting with compassion. And this is important because so often compassion is conceived of as a feeling or an intrinsic way of being, and rather we think of it more as a verb. It is a way of showing up in the world and acting with and towards other people. It is inherently relational in that regard, and it is something for which is really a struggle for many people. I think when we break it down in these steps that you're about to see here, you'll notice that at any point along this action plan, we can fall short, we can be tripped up and face challenges, and that all we can do is try again, or to own up to it and to learn from it. So what does it take to act with compassion? First, we have to notice that someone is suffering or in pain or experiencing trauma. They're distressed in some way. And for many of us, I'm referring to either those we care for or for our children, but this could be anyone. Perhaps it's a partner, perhaps it's a coworker or a colleague. We need to be vigilant and mindful of what others are experiencing. And I don't know about you, but it's really challenging right now when a lot of our interactions are online or via Zoom, or I'm fatigued because of all my Zooming. Zoom fatigue is real. Or if I'm suffering in some way, maybe my mental health is a bit in the tank, it's really hard to recognize what's going on with other people. And so there's all sorts of complications with just our ability to notice what other people are experiencing. If we are able to notice what's going on with others, we can engage in this element of a self-check. So important. We turn inward to check in with ourselves, to ascertain any implicit biases we might be bringing to the conversation, or how previous interactions with this person might be biasing how we're going to proceed forward, or the way in which we're approaching the conversation. And sometimes our self-checks, quite frankly, indicate to us it's not a good time. We're not in a good place right now to have this conversation or to be helpful or to show up with compassion. This has happened to me so frequently as of late that I need to take a breath and maybe ask for a little bit of a break before coming back to a conversation that could be volatile or that could be in some way, shape, or form triggering for me. If we are able to proceed with this conversation in a healthy way, then we get curious. We want to learn more and seek to understand. And this isn't getting everybody's background and everything and anything going on in someone's life. Instead, it's, what's most meaningful? What is a little bit of the context so I can get a sense as to maybe what the needs are moving forward, and in particularly, what are you feeling? And what strengths might you be bringing to this conversation, or that I know about you? So we all have them. As we're able to learn more and get curious or engage in some humility, then we can cultivate this sense of empathy. And empathy is really the connection to the feelings that underlie the experience. We don't have to have had the same exact experience or identity or be in the same role or capacity as someone else to feel empathy, but rather it's about that shared sense of connectedness. If you think back to self-compassion, it's that element of common humanity. oh, you're feeling something that seems to suggest you're anxious. I can connect to times in my life I've felt anxious too. As we're able to cultivate that sense of empathy, we want to move towards really figuring out a good approach forward. And when I say that, I don't mean a fix it mentality. I don't mean offering solutions or suggesting what it was that's worked for us in the past or what we know research suggests is best practice, because we're all individuals and we all have those unique strengths and needs that I referenced earlier. And so this discerning best action is really about helping others learn their own best approach forward, their own solution, accessing their own wisdom. And in order to do this, we really need to believe that people, including young people, including those we care for, have the ability, the capability, and the desire to really access that wisdom and find those solutions. It's that growth mindset mentality that if you're in the education field, you might hear of or be beaten over the head with on a number of occasions. So it's that co-planning. And then we need to follow through. We need to do what is requested of us or what is needed, and to proceed. And especially important when we make a commitment, to act on it, to do it, and to do it as we say or really as we speak, because it is not compassionate in intention alone. And I'll just leave us with that, because I think that's really powerful for me. That element of follow through with people who are perhaps having faced trauma or having had trust issues, or to some extent that follow through so very important. And one more comment on that discerning best action piece is, I know that is a sticking point and a challenge for many of us. Oftentimes when we ask, what is it you need from me right now? Or what would be helpful? Often it is, I needed to talk to someone. I needed to vent. I needed a shoulder to cry on. I needed to get this off my chest. That element of listening, very often incredibly powerful, and meets someone where they're at and in terms of their needs at this point in time, rather than inferring what those needs happen to be. So it looks complicated. I think that even in the work that we've done with clinicians, therapists, and people who are well-versed in nonviolent communication, this can be challenging. It can be challenging, especially when we are ourselves fatigued in some way or burnt out. And as I mentioned, I'm going to share with you what that looks like in practice for parents and caregivers. And so this image has actually been pretty popular. Our toolkit has visuals associated with all its key sections. And this visual has been one that's really stood out to people. People like cats, I guess. Anyway, a fun little way to make what could be an overwhelming topic a little bit more playful and perhaps relatable. What does fatigue look like in parents and caregivers? Well, I will tell you, it tends to start before we even notice it. And it is that of the zealot. It is when we are really passionate and committed, and we want to go the extra mile for everything and anything. Perhaps this is as a new parent where you want to have homemade organic baby food and cloth diapers, and you hold yourself to these really high expectations. Or perhaps it's when we hear that we're transitioning to being home and you are working from home and being a homemaker and being a school teacher all in one, and hoping that you can wear all of those many hats with 100% effectiveness day in and day out. Or that zealotness may be when we are facing some sort of change with our young people and with the experiences that they have. Maybe you have a young person in your life who is getting a new diagnosis of a mental health challenge, and we are spinning our wheels, trying every avenue possible that we can to find help, to find support, to find the right medication regimen, to find whatever would be helpful for our young person's well-being. So this zealot stage is one where we can overwhelm ourselves by doing too much, having unrealistic expectations of ourselves or those around us, and end up spinning our wheels, in fact. And then as we proceed to do this, and as we learn more, we start to see some of those imperfections, those ways in which different systems of support or individuals aren't who we need them to be, or can't have the solutions that we're seeking, and we can't fix it, we can't make it right in some way. And so we start to get irritable. We start to recognize we can't hold ourselves up to those expectations day in and day out, or for too long of a duration, or at particular times in the semester or amidst COVID. And I don't know about you, but when I get irritable, I get to be a grumpy cat. And in my personal life, in my family life, I am easier to anger. I'm less creative with the ideas that I bring to how we interact with one another. I get sad. I do have like a low grade depression, and some of my symptoms of depression may start to come out at this stage. And I might start to feel like there aren't solutions, hopeless or helpless, like nothing will suffice, nothing will help, I guess. And as we start to see those cracks, as we start to spin our wheels, as we start to get kind of exhausted in some way, we also start to withdraw from the people around us. We start to isolate. That element of common humanity may go out the window. We are chronically overwhelmed, and this could start to manifest in some physical indicators of stress. And abiding by those steps to compassionate action, that follow through, that element of empathy, that element of taking the time it needs to get curious, may fall by the wayside despite our good intentions. And it's really self-protective. We're taking on too much, we're overwhelmed, we're feeling a sense of hopelessness. So it's really natural to withdraw. And in work settings, if there are any of you on the in the audience here thinking, wow, this sounds familiar and I can relate to it in workplace as well, this element may manifest as absenteeism, presenteeism, different ways that we don't show up. For our kids, it may mean we're not having those consistent dinner times that we used to, or we're having them tune out to television or other forms of screen time more often than in the past. It may well be that we are not really finding the joy, frankly, in our interactions or in our family dynamics that we at one point in time did. And if we continue in this vein, it can lead to feeling like a zombie, like we are just going through the motions. We are in survival mode, sink or swim. We're giving it our all and feeling as if our all is never good enough. We have this sense of being persecuted, like our children are out to get us. We might start to think more negatively about the people around us with whom we interact. We might start to think we're the only one who can do something. So perhaps we take on more of the tasks at home. Perhaps we let our boundaries start to slip. Perhaps we have this chronic sense of anxiety that keeps us up at night and starts to really impose itself on us and on our mental and physical well-being. And so hopefully we catch this fatigue prior to the zombie stage. Oftentimes, those who tend to come to such presentations are not in a zombie stage. Zombies often feel as if they can't take on one more thing, quite frankly. And yet, when I'm going through these stages, you may recognize yourself, or you may think, been there, or in one of those right now, feeling it. Me too, I would say. In fact, I tend to zip around from stage to stage throughout the course of the day more often than not, if I'm being frank. And I think that's normal, it's typical, and it's pretty pervasive to feel this sense of fatigue, even without all of the external uncertainties and challenges that have been going on the last 8 or 9 months. And so I want to urge you to give yourself some grace, because the shame and blame can just perpetuate being in this cycle all the longer. So fortunately, if you recognize yourself here, the remainder of our toolkit and our strategies are really designed to be helpful to stave off fatigue, to nip it in the bud, or to minimize the consequences of being in these particular stages, so to speak. And so I'm hoping to impart to you a number of those key strategies that you can use, where I think the downside of it being a presentation style right now, as opposed to a small group conversation, is you aren't able to learn from one another's wisdom. I think that element of common humanity, all the more apparent when we talk to each other. We talk to other parents and we hear what irritability is like for them. We talk to other caregivers and we hear them admit that they've experienced this too. It's so powerful. We have found when leading these small group conversations or these parenting and caregiving talks that the normalization is just like a breath of fresh air. So I'm hoping that rather than this seem daunting or promoting shame and blame, that you recognize that element of common humanity there. And here's the reminder, if I didn't manage to say it before, it is a normal response to feeling overwhelmed, to dealing with complexity, to having challenges, whether interpersonal, professional, or in interacting with people around us. And so that element of grace, so key. So what can we do about it? Well, quite a bit, fortunately. I'm just going to, again, hit the tip of the iceberg as to some of the core strategies that we've recognized as helpful for parents and caregivers. The first is to recognize what it is that's driving our fatigue and what it is that's really helping us maintain a sense of resilience, and then trying to build upon those elements we have more control around while letting go of some of those that we don't. So what do I mean by that? We tend to have people generate a lengthy list of that which makes them feel fatigued, puts them in that cycle, and then what also fills them up, makes them feel joyful or hopeful or resilient in the face of adversity. And so I want to give you a sense as to what tends to come up in conversations like this with parents. This is an actual list taken from one of our previous parent groups. See if you can identify with any of it that's listed here. So what drives our fatigue? My children don't sleep. There are not as many supports as I need during COVID-19. Probably far more that we can add that are COVID specific here or that are related to the social and political unrest that we've been experiencing all the more as of late. It might be that when working at home, as I am right now, there is not the space that we need. We don't have boundaries. We don't have privacy. We don't have the comfort of an office or our colleagues as readily as we had before. Social media and news and constant negativity, driver of fatigue that tends to come up in virtually every group that I've done. A number of additional ones listed here, and you could very well make your own list. In fact, you could very well be doing so right now as I'm talking. And then obviously a number of things that facilitate well-being as well, drivers of resilience. Maybe you could add to the list attending presentations such as this to learn more, to feel connected with others, to take time for yourselves. And so these drivers of resilience and fatigue, there are some which we as parents or caregivers have control around, and there are some that we don't. And so recognizing that, it helps because we can sort of cross out the things that are external to us. So for example, I live in Wisconsin. I imagine most of you on the call here today do. Unfortunately, I cannot control the weather. If it's another driver of fatigue, unfortunately, I cannot control whether the Packers win. Number of those elements that frankly, we can write off as something that is consuming too much of our thought process when we're dwelling on it. Others we have some degree of control around, maybe if we have the correct resources and supports that we really need. And so mental health comes to mind. Some of us have a higher degree of a locus of control around our mental health and treatment and supports for it than others do, as a function of what we have available to us and what we're doing regarding our mental health. And then there are some which the majority of people or virtually anyone can craft some degree of control around, either as they already recognize that they have that control, or it can be learned. So for example, having boundaries perhaps, and when working from home, boundaries is something that I can have control around and do something about. What tends to happen as we engage in this process with parents and caregivers is they see two things. One, that they have far more control than they thought that they had, particularly in the things that fuel our resilience. And so 9 times out of 10, we go through these lists, and the majority that is in the filling up my resilience bucket, we can have some degree of control around. The second thing that tends to become apparent is those things with which we lack control around, and how much time or energy they tend to take up or consume for us. And so maybe we recognize that we're spinning our wheels 70% of the time on the things for which we lack control, or we're talking about and inserting this element of constant negativity when we are always discussing the things for which we lack a sense of control. And so what we can do then is shift to focusing on building our locus of control, particularly around that which feeds or maintains our well-being and our resilience. And so that's been really insightful, I think, for a number of people to do as an activity. When in a professional environment, teams tend to do this together. So rather than an individual, say one person within a family or caregiving relationship doing this, teams of people contribute. And then teams can work together to really hone those aspects that feed their resilience. And so this is just emblematic of the activity regarding our locus of control, and a way to visualize those elements from the previous lists and the degree of control we feel over it. There's also a way we can shift some of our perspective around some of this. And so during our small group conversations, what's fascinating is when somebody has a light bulb moment and recognizes that perhaps I do have more of a degree of control than I previously thought, because the wisdom of others in the group or the audience is really contributing to that perspective shift for someone. So for example, someone in a previous group said, I am inundated with news and negativity and constant information overload. And somebody said, would you like to hear some strategies that I've used to stave off that overload? And so it's been helpful as a way to learn from one another to really have this conversation. 9 times out of 10, the next 2 things I'm going to talk about come up on those lists in some way, shape, or form. And people tend to differ as to whether they have control over them or not. And so naturally, as we are in the business of offering perspective shift, we wanted to have them be a part of the toolkit. And so there tends to be something that emerges as a driver of fatigue related to expectations. Perhaps it's, I don't know what my spouse or partner really expects of me on a daily basis. Perhaps it's, I don't really have a way of communicating expectations with my child's teacher in a virtual capacity. Perhaps at work, I'm unclear of the change in expectations when I've moved to working virtually or in a different capacity. And so really the key with expectations is helping to identify those which are realistic from those that aren't, whether they're for ourselves, expectations we have of others, maybe for others we interact with in our family life, or expectations for our young people, or whether they're expectations that are placed upon us. And so we have strategies in the toolkit to really address all of the ways in which unhealthy expectations might be precipitating fatigue, because we might have unreasonable expectations for others. We might have them for ourselves, And honestly, those in the health and human service professions and social service professions are much more apt to have unrealistic expectations for ourselves than we are for those of others. Or there might be a lack of transparency or an uncertainty related to the expectations others have of us. So we really invite some learning and dialogue about how we can better align expectations within all three of those various approaches. And then we talk about how expectations, at least for our young people, often need to change as a function of what we know about them. And so if those of you on the call here are at all familiar with aspects of temperament, this might be old hat. If those of you on the call here have multiple children for whom you care, this is probably going to be pretty relatable in some way. It's the idea that our expectations are often needed to shift as a function of context or with whom we're interacting. So with young people, when it comes to temperament, the same expectations that my parents or caregivers had of me as a first child who doesn't have mental health challenges, who is handling daily living fairly well. It is, at least right now, adjusting pretty well to the pandemic, may not be the same expectations that my parents have of somebody else in my family who's struggling a bit, or who has mental health challenges or developmental health challenges, or a temperament that's very different from my own, or has different needs as a function perhaps of living circumstances or economic situation. And so again, those expectations, we all too often fall back on keeping them consistent across time, place, experience, relationship, when in fact, oftentimes ought to be much more adaptable than they actually are. And this is the very idea of in a work setting, creating accommodations for people in some way to account for their needs, for strengths, and for temperament. So much of the toolkit, I will say, is application of strategies that we use in other capacities or for our young people, and applying them to ourselves as adults or as caregivers. For instance, when thinking about expectations, one of the strategies that we engage in is talking about our expectations for ourselves when we become dysregulated. And you know what? Do we know what those expectations are? I would imagine many people don't. And yet we're all very often using emotional regulation plans with our young people, and adults can benefit from them as well. Here are my needs. Here's what compromises my needs. Here is how I look, act, sound if I'm becoming dysregulated or my needs aren't being met. And here is what I need when I become dysregulated. Like how powerful to know what those needs are of people in our personal life. And then, as I mentioned, boundaries follows expectations. They overlap so well with one another as a function of some of our expectations, hopefully that are realistic after going through some of the strategies we share in our toolkit content. We may then need to craft boundaries in order to support those expectations, or in order to help support somebody else in meeting those expectations. And so what I've learned about boundaries in doing this work comes from Brené Brown. If you're at all familiar with Brené Brown, fantastic researcher and scholar and author. And she tells us that when we act to have boundaries, it is one of the most compassionate things that we can do. It is self-compassionate because we are recognizing our own needs. And it is compassionate to others because it keeps us out of resentment. If I continuously have boundaries being violated, I get angry, I feel badly, I point the finger at people. A lot of emotional volatility tends to come as a result. And so by establishing clear boundaries, with and for other people, I'm able to stave off that element of dysregulation, of that fatigue, of that resentment, and maintain that connection or that compassionate interaction with someone. And so what do we do in regard to boundaries? This is one of the most popular content areas for parents. When we take a little bit of a unique approach to the concept of boundaries. And so I want to spend a little bit of time on it. And so we advocate that when we have boundaries, we are often trying to meet our values, our priorities, or our expectations that I previously alluded to. And so we always have a yes anytime there is a no. It's recognizing that yes and vocalizing it that can help us to establish boundaries sometimes more clearly or transparently. And so here's a number of yeses that some families that we've worked with have mentioned to us. When they want to show up for their family at their best, to be the most compassionate, and to act as they want to act, here are some of the things they mention they want to do. Here are some of the values. They talk together politely or respectfully. They have family dinner time. They engage in vulnerable practices with one another. They're able to accept one another. They offer and accept help. Think about what some of your yeses are, your family values or priorities. They may well look similarly to what's on this list, and they may well differ. But one of the first steps to establishing boundaries is recognizing what we want to prioritize. And so what does that look like? Well, on the one side of the PowerPoint here is that same list of what our family looks like at its best. And we often need to have boundaries or establish some no's, whether they're permeable or flexible or really staunch no's, in order to support these priorities. And so if I want to have family dinners where I'm engaged, I need to potentially limit other things that would take me away or make me or others be disengaged. So what might that sound like? It might sound like, I value having family dinners together. To do so, can we not have our cell phones at the dinner table? So there is a way in which we're establishing our values, making them really transparent, while then proceeding to have what our boundary is that we need in order to best do that. Or we have heard from young people or seen from others in our family environments, they may well need in order to best and most consistently abide by that value or priority. I'll take another look at some examples here in a moment. Or no, I won't. I guess I didn't insert that slide. So let me give you one more example from the list that's here to make it a little bit more apparent. So I have needed to obviously establish a little bit of private space in order to do my work. So I might suggest something like, it's really important to me to offer people confidentiality and privacy when I'm working with them from home. Therefore, when my door is shut, I need for you to respect that and not come in during my office hours or something to that effect. There's my priority, my value, my need, and my boundary following it. Here's how to do that in a few handy dandy steps. And again, all of this material and the strategies that are behind what I'm sharing with you are on the website, compassionresilienceToolkit.org, and freely available to you.
And Dr. Reed, I did post that in the chat, by the way, too. So
you are on it.
So it's
Thank
quick
you
for people who have joined us a few minutes late. So there you go. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ron. So we need to first know our yeses, and that helps when we identify our values and priorities, which I said. Then have meetings to discuss when these boundaries come into play. And so rather than postponing it, do it in the moment. This is an element of what we call behavioral activation, because if you don't do it in the moment, you may forget. If you're fatigued, may fall by the wayside. Or if you're not proactive about it, may not come out as compassionately as outlined here. So being proactive tends to be helpful. Be really frank or forthright and direct, using short, simple, succinct language, similar to the examples that I gave earlier. Reinforce when it's not happening almost immediately if you recognize it. You see those cell phones on the table, issue the reminder. Remember, we've all promised or committed to not having our cell phones at the dinner table. Rather than waiting, have explanations also be really specific to the individual and so that they're mutually advantageous in some way. I really value hearing how your day at school went. I really value hearing how you're doing and about your day. Can we put our phones down for the next 20 minutes for the remainder of the meal? Something that also is engaging to someone else. So it's not solely about us, it's reciprocal. And then be sure to back those boundaries up with action, because otherwise we're inviting people to not only ignore our needs, but we're going down a path potentially to that resentment, potentially to that fatigue cycle as a result. So 6 steps for how to be compassionate in setting our boundaries. And this is hard. This is hard stuff. Just like those steps to compassionate action are hard, doesn't necessarily come naturally. It is something for which I work on day in and day out, and definitely a strategy in which to hone. The last really big strategy within the toolkit that's not related to specific well-being strategies, and I say that because the last 4 sections of the Compassion Resilience Toolkit are about personal well-being or self-care strategies, and we think that gets a lot of attention, and so we tend to focus more on these culture aspects, family culture aspects, is that of building a model for how we can influence people in our personal life, whether it's our kids or a partner or someone else in our family, based on the model of influence that is outlined here. What do people need in order to be influenced by us in terms of our attitudes, behaviors, and to impart perhaps those values or priorities onto others? Well, first, they need the information that it's important. They need the information that it is a priority. We can't hold people to expectations if we haven't made them clear. I think that a pretty reasonable expectation. And so that informational element really, really key. We then need to act as a model. And so living up to that priority or value ourselves, that's the element of role modeling or being a template or doing as we say, so that we don't need to then tell people to do as we say, not as we do. So aligning what we do and what we say. We need to also provide experiences for people, for young people, in which to practice these expectations or process this new information. So what do I mean by this knowledge base here? My coworker, Emily, has a 3-year-old. She's trying to teach her 3-year-old how to be polite when interacting with people and how to be respectful. And so the informational element is, Leora, here is what being polite and respectful means, so that we have this consistency with how we're defining respect, because otherwise it can be ambiguous. Ron and I could argue all day as to what respect means. And so Leora knows the expectation means saying please and thank you, hello, goodbye, and to that effect. Emily also then serves as an example by doing this when Leora is around. Emily also offers Leora opportunities to engage with different people, perhaps strangers, perhaps extended family, perhaps her older brother and sister, in which to practice this and to then perhaps have the next aspects here that can reinforce that behavior. And so the will to act, these other elements of modeling, are related to our attitudes, any consequences assigned to the expectation or to not meeting the expectation, and then offering ourselves and the other person an element of that grace or compassion. So our attitude is believing that someone is capable of doing what we expect. It's that element of growth mindset. It is the belief Emily has in Leora that she's capable of being respectful, of being polite, regardless of whom she's interacting with. She can convey that through how she talks to Leora. Leora, I'm so proud of you when you act respectfully towards others. Leora, I really believe that you can say please and thank you regularly to your grandparents. She's communicating a belief in her potential. So powerful. Way to stave off some of that negative self-talk that Leora might have otherwise. Consequences can be positive or negative, affirming or otherwise. So often it is much more influential to act with positive consequences. Maybe that's rewards for when Leora is acting or meeting that expectation, or maybe that is some type of verbal affirmation, like I just indicated, or maybe it is public praise as well with young people. Number of ways in which to have positive affirmation in that example I gave. If Leora isn't consistently meeting the expectation, we can have an element of grace. It is a learning experience and opportunity. She may well fall short at times, just as we might. And when we need that element of grace, it's also an opportunity for us as parents and caregivers to reflect on where we might have fallen short. Did we not provide Leora enough opportunities to practice? Did we not clarify the expectation? Were we not acting in accordance with our own expectation? Was I not affirming enough in a way that Leora could respond to? Do I need to shift my expectation because of Leora's temperament? So this model here is meant to imply a mechanism through which we can have influence on those people we serve, on our young people, in a way that accounts for what we've shared previously, accounts for that element of boundaries, of having clear expectations, and of acting in a way that supports others' compassion for themselves in the process. And so that's a lot. That is a lot to cover in an hour. You can see why we have 12 hours typically of small talk and conversations in order to best learn from one another, in order to best practice some of these strategies, and in order ultimately to try to build that camaraderie with other parents and caregivers so we can build that element of common humanity. And so I want to just share with you that if any of these strategies seemed really interesting to you or relevant, or something that you thought might be helpful to addressing your own fatigue, not only is the entire toolkit and all of the activities and content on that Compassion Resilience website I mentioned, but there are also COVID-19 specific blogs and videos on the key activities. And so if you want a quick 1-minute read on how to do that activity related to the locus of control, it is on the website. If you want a quick 1-minute way in which to really think about how self-compassion can fuel us during the pandemic and during what we're experiencing now, there's a blog and video explaining it to you in a much probably neater, more concise way than I have done so. And so I would absolutely refer you to that as a resource base and to use as you see fit. We are in the, we are fortunate to give all of this away, not holding you accountable to doing any of it with fidelity, but to making the most of it that you possibly can for yourselves and your families and those you serve or care for. So with that, I am going to say thank you very much for your patience and for any technological challenges that may have existed outside of my knowledge, and then turn it over to Ron to see if there are any questions that you all have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reed. Appreciate your energy. And thank you so much again, Dr. Reed, for your time, and everyone else for giving up their evening as well to hear about this information.
I will just say, Ron, so we're mostly accustomed to either doing small groups of participants in conversations or to training parents and caregivers to be facilitators of other conversations. And so if anyone in the audience tonight is interested in training to become a facilitator, please don't hesitate to reach out. We are very interested in leading additional virtual trainings. There is a sizable time commitment to leading these groups, and yet I think that you'd see that the outcomes are so incredibly palpable. We see an increase in the self-compassion of the people who participate, an increase in the sense of camaraderie and social bonding and social support that people experience when having these conversations, and this learning element of learning from the wisdom of the group and the crowd has imparted a number of different strategies into group participants. And so again, if you're interested, please don't hesitate to reach out. I will put my personal email address in the chat window if you want to learn more.